Late one stormy evening, a man named James was driving home after a long day of work. The road ahead was narrow, winding, and desolate, stretching out through a vast countryside. Dark clouds hung overhead, and the rain lashed against his windshield, making visibility difficult. As his car's headlights pierced the gloom, James noticed a lone figure standing by the roadside, drenched and motioning for a ride. She was a young woman, her hair and clothes soaked through. She looked lost, vulnerable, and utterly out of place on such a remote stretch of road at such a late hour. Feeling a mix of concern and unease, James slowed down and pulled over. He rolled down the window and asked, "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The woman nodded, her face pale and her expression distant. "Please take me home," she said softly. Her voice was barely audible over the sound of the rain. She climbed into the passenger seat, shivering slightly from the cold. Her clothes looked old-fashioned, as though they belonged to a different time. A simple dress and a shawl that seemed oddly out of place. James asked for her address, and she quietly recited it. The drive resumed, the road snaking through the eerie, rain-soaked landscape. For a while, they drove in silence. James tried to make conversation, but the woman only answered in short, curt responses. She never looked at him, instead staring out the window, her hands resting motionless in her lap. There was something unsettling about her presence, but James pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the drive. After several miles, they arrived at the address she had provided, a small, dilapidated house on the edge of town. The place looked old, the paint peeling and the yard overgrown. It had clearly seen better days. James turned to tell the woman they had arrived, but his words caught in his throat. The seat next to him was empty. He blinked, bewildered. Just moments ago, she had been sitting right there. He hadn't heard the car door open, and there was no sign of her leaving. Panic began to set in. Where had she gone? James quickly got out of the car, peering into the darkness, calling out for the woman. But there was no answer. The only sound was the relentless rain pounding against the roof of his car. Unsure of what to do, James approached the old house and knocked on the door. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman appeared. Her face was worn with age, her eyes tired but kind. She looked surprised to see a stranger standing on her porch at this hour. "I'm sorry to bother you," James began, still shaken, "but I just gave a young woman a ride here. She asked me to bring her to this address, but now she's gone. I don't know where she went." The old woman's face changed in an instant. Her eyes widened and she let out a small gasp, her hand rising to her mouth in shock. "What did she look like?" she asked, her voice trembling. James described the woman, the soaked dress, her pale complexion, the way she barely spoke. The elderly woman's eyes filled with sorrow, and she slowly shook her head. "You must have met my daughter," the woman whispered, her voice filled with grief. "But she died many years ago." James felt his heart skip a beat. "That can't be," he stammered. "I just gave her a ride. She was sitting right there in my car." The old woman nodded sadly. "My daughter was killed on that road in a terrible car accident almost 20 years ago now. She was on her way home trying to get a ride, but no one stopped for her until it was too late." James felt a cold chill run down his spine as the realization hit him. He had picked up a ghost, a spirit that had never found peace. The old woman motioned for him to come inside, and she showed him a faded photograph that sat on the mantelpiece. James's blood ran cold. Staring back at him from the photograph was the very same woman he had just given a ride to. The room spun, and he staggered backward, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The woman in the picture had been dead for 2 decades, and yet he had spoken to her. He had felt her presence in the car, heard her voice, and seen her sitting beside him. The realization that he had interacted with a spirit sent waves of fear and confusion through him. The elderly woman explained that every few years, someone would stop and give her daughter a ride, always on the anniversary of her death. The hitchhiker would never make it home, vanishing just as mysteriously as she had appeared. It was as though her spirit was still wandering the lonely road, seeking the help she had never received in life. James left the house, deeply disturbed by what had happened. He got into his car, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. He glanced one last time at the empty seat beside him, half expecting the ghostly figure to reappear. But there was nothing, just an empty seat and the sound of the rain. As he drove away, the events of the night replayed in his mind over and over again. The ride, the vanishing, the revelation, it all felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He would never forget that night, or the strange, sad hitchhiker he had picked up on the dark, lonely road. For as long as he lived, he would always wonder, was she still out there, waiting for another driver to stop, trying to make her way home? It was a quiet evening in a peaceful suburban neighborhood when Jenny, a college student looking for extra cash, arrived at the Thompsons' home to babysit their 2 young children. The house was large and warmly lit, filled with the comforting hum of family life. The Thompsons gave her the usual instructions. Bedtime was at 8:30, snacks were in the fridge, and there was an emergency number by the phone. After thanking her and giving a final wave goodbye, they left for their dinner reservation, promising to be back around midnight. The children, Emily and Ben, were easy to manage. After a quick dinner and some cartoons, Jenny tucked them into bed upstairs and went back downstairs to the living room. The house was eerily quiet now, the only sounds being the faint creaking of the old wooden floors and the occasional rustle of wind outside. Jenny settled on the couch, flicking through TV channels absent-mindedly, occasionally checking her phone to pass the time. It was sometime around 9:30 when the phone rang. The shrill sound startled her. She picked up the receiver, expecting to hear the Thompsons checking in. "Hello?" she asked. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then a man's voice, low and breathy, asked, "Have you checked on the children?" Jenny frowned. She wasn't sure if it was some prank or just a wrong number. "Who is this?" she demanded, but there was no response, just the click of the line going dead. Shrugging it off, she hung up, figuring it was probably someone trying to scare her. The kids were asleep, safe upstairs, and there was nothing to worry about. A little more time passed. Jenny tried to shake the unsettling feeling, but the house felt different now. The shadows seemed longer, the creaks of the old house louder. And then, the phone rang again. She hesitated before answering this time. "Hello?" Again the same low voice. "Why haven't you checked on the children?" Her heart skipped a beat. This wasn't funny anymore. She slammed the phone down, her pulse quickening. She thought about calling the police, but didn't want to seem like an overreacting babysitter. Maybe it was just some kids pulling a prank. After all, she was in a nice, safe neighborhood, and the doors were locked. But as the minutes ticked by, her nerves started to fray. She couldn't shake the creepy feeling that she was being watched. She stood up, glancing toward the stairs that led to the children's rooms. Should she check on them? What if the caller wasn't just playing a sick joke? Then the phone rang again. This time, she answered with a trembling voice. "Who is this?" she whispered. The voice on the other end was even more menacing now. "You should check on the children," it repeated, with an unsettling calm. Jenny hung up, her hands shaking. Without hesitation, she dialed the police. As the phone rang, she paced around the living room, keeping an eye on the stairs. "Police department, how can we help?" the voice on the other end asked. I've been getting these weird calls. Someone keeps asking me if I've checked on the kids," she blurted out, trying to stay calm. "Are you alone in the house?" the dispatcher asked. "Just me and the kids. They're asleep upstairs." "All right, we're going to trace the call. Stay on the line and keep calm. Can you lock the doors?" "I already did," she whispered. Her heart was racing now, pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. As she stood near the living room window, the darkness outside seemed to press in, as if something or someone was lurking just beyond her view. The minutes felt like hours as the operator stayed on the line. Suddenly, there was a click, and the voice on the other end became urgent. "Listen to me very carefully," the dispatcher said, his voice tense. "You need to get out of the house right now. The calls are coming from inside the house." Jenny froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What?" she whispered in disbelief. "The calls are coming from a line inside your house. Get out now." She dropped the phone, her mind racing. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then in a sudden burst of panic, she ran for the stairs. She had to get to the children. Her legs felt heavy as she raced up the steps, 2 at a time, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway upstairs was pitch black, except for the sliver of light coming from under the children's bedroom door. As she reached for the doorknob, a loud creak echoed from the end of the hallway, near the attic stairs. Someone was in the house with her. Swallowing her fear, she burst into the children's room and found them sound asleep, completely unaware of the terror unfolding around them. She grabbed them both, one under each arm, and bolted down the stairs. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps overhead now, slow and deliberate. With her heart hammering in her chest, she sprinted toward the front door, fumbled with the lock for what felt like an eternity, and finally threw the door open. Just as she stepped out into the cold night air, she heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open upstairs. Someone was coming down. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car cut through the darkness. Jenny ran toward them, the children still clutched in her arms, her legs trembling beneath her. As she reached the safety of the officers, she turned back to see a shadowy figure standing in the front window of the house, watching her with cold, unblinking eyes. The police rushed inside and quickly searched the house. Minutes later, they emerged, grim-faced. "We found him in the attic," one officer said, his voice serious. "He must have been watching you the entire time." Jenny collapsed in a fit of sobs, clutching the children tightly to her. The nightmare was over, but the thought that someone had been inside the house with her, watching her every move, was something she would never be able to shake. For the rest of her life, the sound of a phone ringing would always send a chill down her spine, reminding her of the night when a seemingly ordinary babysitting job became a horrifying fight for survival. In the quiet, misty streets of a small Japanese town, there was a legend that parents often whispered to their children to keep them from wandering out alone at night. It was the story of Kuchisake Onna, the slit-mouthed woman. As the tale went, she was once a beautiful woman, but jealousy, betrayal, and cruelty had led her to a gruesome fate. Her mouth was slit from ear to ear by her jealous husband, turning her smile into a twisted, permanent grin. Now her restless spirit wandered the streets, concealed by a surgical mask, seeking out lone travelers and asking the same eerie question, "Am I pretty?" One cold evening, a high school student named Hiroshi found himself walking home after an evening study session. The streets were eerily empty, shrouded in fog, and the only sound was the soft echo of his footsteps. As he rounded a corner, a figure appeared in the distance, a woman dressed in a long coat, her face obscured by a mask. She moved with unnatural grace as she approached him, her eyes locked onto his. "Am I pretty?" she asked in a soft, sweet voice that sent a chill down Hiroshi's spine. Startled, he hesitated, but politely answered, "Yes." The woman's eyes gleamed with an unsettling glint. Slowly, she removed her mask, revealing her horrifying, disfigured smile. Her mouth stretched wide, sliced open from ear to ear, her teeth gleaming under the dim streetlight. "How about now?" she asked, her voice now laced with menace. Hiroshi's heart raced, and fear gripped him. He realized that no answer could save him. If he said no, she would kill him on the spot. If he said yes, she would take out her sharp scissors and mutilate his face to look like hers. Panic set in, and he stammered, taking a step back, but her eyes followed him with a predatory gaze. In a sudden rush of adrenaline, he remembered a story his grandmother had told him, that if you confuse Kuchisake Onna with a clever answer, it might buy you time to escape. With his voice trembling, he blurted out, "You look average." The woman froze for a moment, her head tilting in confusion, as if the answer didn't fit into her deadly game. That moment of hesitation was all Hiroshi needed. Without another thought, he turned and sprinted down the street, the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel her presence, her footsteps quickening behind him. The wind howled as he ran, and the darkness seemed to close in, but somehow Hiroshi made it home, slamming the door behind him. Panting, he leaned against the door, his mind racing, wondering if he had truly escaped her wrath, or if Kuchisake Onna was still out there, waiting for another answer to her terrifying question. It was a balmy summer night, the kind where the air was thick with the scent of pine and the sound of crickets filled the quiet spaces. Tom and Lisa had decided to take a drive out to their favorite secluded spot on the outskirts of town, a place where they could escape the noise of the city and enjoy each other's company. The narrow, winding road took them deep into a wooded area, far from the bustling streets and into the heart of nature, where only the moonlit sky and the rustling of leaves kept them company. Tom parked the car under a large oak tree, and they settled in for what they thought would be a peaceful, romantic evening. As they sat in the car, talking and laughing, the radio softly played in the background. The world outside the car was still and serene. It felt as though they were the only two people for miles, wrapped in the kind of solitude that was both comforting and eerie. After a while, Lisa shifted in her seat, glancing out the window at the thick darkness surrounding them. She always felt a little nervous being so far from town, but Tom, as usual, reassured her. "Relax," he said with a grin. "Nothing to worry about out here. It's just us and the stars." Just as Lisa began to relax, the soft melody on the radio was abruptly interrupted by a crackling news bulletin. The voice on the radio was sharp and urgent. "This is a breaking news alert. Authorities have just reported that a dangerous criminal has escaped from the local mental institution. The man, convicted of multiple murders, is considered armed and dangerous. He is easily identifiable by a hook he wears in place of his right hand. Residents in the area are advised to stay indoors and keep their doors locked. If you see anything suspicious, contact the police immediately." Lisa's blood ran cold. She turned to Tom, her face pale. "Tom, did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tom, ever the skeptic, chuckled lightly, brushing off her concern. "Yeah, I heard it. But come on, Lisa, it's just the radio trying to spook people. We're miles away from that place. There's no way anything's going to happen out here." But Lisa couldn't shake the growing fear that had settled deep in her chest. Her eyes darted nervously to the windows, scanning the darkness as if she could sense something lurking just out of sight. The thick shadows of the trees seemed to move in the moonlight, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made her jump. "Tom, please, let's just go," she said, her voice more urgent now. "I don't feel right about this." Tom sighed, seeing the fear in her eyes. He didn't want to ruin the night, but he also didn't want to upset her any further. Okay, he said, turning the key in the ignition. The car roared to life, the headlights slicing through the darkness as they pulled back onto the gravel road that led out of the woods. As they drove, the mood shifted. The playful atmosphere from earlier had evaporated, replaced by a tense silence. Lisa sat rigidly in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes wide as she watched the road ahead. The drive back felt longer than it should have, the trees looming on either side of the road like silent sentinels. The night seemed unnaturally quiet, as if even the crickets had fallen silent, sensing something amiss. Lisa glanced behind them more than once, her anxiety growing with every passing minute. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, though each time she looked, there was nothing but darkness stretching behind them. Tom remained calm, though even he was starting to feel uneasy. The way Lisa kept looking out the windows, her fingers tapping nervously on the seat, made him grip the steering wheel a little tighter. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached Lisa's house. Tom pulled into the driveway, relieved to be back in the familiar surroundings of the neighborhood. The glow from the porch light felt welcoming, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the woods. He parked the car and turned to Lisa with a smile. "See? Nothing to worry about. We're safe now." Lisa nodded, but her unease still hadn't faded completely. She gave him a small, strained smile and opened the car door. As Tom got out and walked around to her side, they both heard it, a soft, metallic clink from the car. They froze, exchanging confused glances. "What was that?" Lisa asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tom frowned and moved toward the driver's side door, his footsteps hesitant, his heart beginning to race. He had dismissed Lisa's fears earlier, but now, standing in the stillness of the night, something about that sound felt wrong, out of place. Tom peered down at the door handle, his stomach flipping when he saw what was hanging from it. A large rusted hook, smeared with blood, swayed gently in the breeze. The sight sent a wave of cold terror rushing through him. He stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. "Lisa," he called out, his voice shaking, "you need to see this." Lisa walked around the car, and when her eyes landed on the bloody hook, she gasped in horror. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as her mind raced to process what she was seeing. The radio report, the fear she'd felt in the woods, the eerie quiet, all of it crashed into her at once. The escaped killer, the man with the hook, had been there. He had been right next to them while they sat in the car, unaware, oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. They stood there, staring at the hook, the realization sinking in. They had narrowly escaped a horrific fate. The night that had started so innocently, with plans of romance and laughter, had turned into a nightmare. Tom and Lisa hurried inside, locking every door and window, their hands trembling. Neither of them spoke, the weight of what had almost happened hanging heavy between them. For days after, the image of the hook haunted them both. They couldn't shake the feeling of how close they had come to death. The town was abuzz with the news of the escaped killer, but no one ever found him. He had vanished into the night, leaving behind only that bloody hook and the chilling memory of the night he almost claimed 2 more victims. And though they never spoke of it to anyone else, Tom and Lisa would never forget the fear that gripped them in those dark woods, the night when the hook-handed man was closer than they ever could have imagined. It was a dreary, rain-soaked night in the quiet suburbs when Sophie, Emma, and Lily gathered at Sophie's house for their regular Friday night sleepover. The storm outside rattled the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance, casting an eerie atmosphere over what was meant to be a fun evening. The 3 friends had spent most of the night telling ghost stories, trying to outscare one another. By the time the clock struck midnight, the conversation had shifted to urban legends, those timeless tales of terror that always seemed to have a kernel of truth buried somewhere within. Emma, the bravest and most daring of the group, brought up one legend they all knew but had never dared to speak of seriously: Bloody Mary. "You know the story," she said, leaning in, her voice low. "You stand in front of a mirror, turn off the lights, and chant Bloody Mary 3 times. Then, if you're unlucky, she appears behind you in the mirror. Her face is covered in blood, her eyes hollow, and if you're really unlucky, she'll either claw your face off or drag you into the mirror with her." Sophie shuddered, her eyes flickering to the large antique mirror hanging on the wall across the room. It had been in her family for years, a heavy, old thing with an ornate frame and a surface so clean it seemed to draw your reflection deeper than it should. "I don't know, guys," she muttered. "I've heard people say weird things happen when you try that. People go missing or they get hurt." Lily, always the skeptic, shrugged. "It's just a silly story. Bloody Mary isn't real. It's just something people tell to freak each other out." Emma smirked, sensing an opportunity. "Well, if you're so sure, why don't we try it?" she challenged. "Let's see if Bloody Mary really exists." She flashed a mischievous grin, her eyes gleaming in the dim candlelight that flickered around the room. Sophie hesitated, but she didn't want to seem scared. Neither did Lily, who despite her bravado felt an uncomfortable twist in her stomach. The room fell quiet, the storm outside suddenly louder, the wind howling as it pressed against the house. After a brief moment of silence, the 3 friends agreed to the dare. Sophie grabbed a small flashlight, turning it off as they gathered in front of the mirror. The room was plunged into near total darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the window. The mirror loomed large in front of them, its surface reflecting the vague outlines of their forms as they stood side by side. The air felt thick and cold, as though the storm outside had somehow seeped into the walls of the house. Emma, standing in the middle, took a deep breath. "On the count of 3, she whispered. 1, 2, 3. In unison, the 3 girls chanted, "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary." At first, nothing happened. The 3 stood in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the mirror, waiting. The reflection showed only their own shadowy figures, distorted by the darkness. For a fleeting moment, they began to relax, thinking the legend was nothing more than a story meant to scare children. But then, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. A chill crept over them, the kind that raises the hairs on the back of your neck. Lily took a step back instinctively, her pulse quickening as a strange fog began to form on the surface of the mirror, as though someone on the other side was breathing heavily against the glass. "Do you see that?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. The mist on the mirror swirled, and within it, a faint, shadowy figure began to emerge. At first it was barely visible, just a blur, but soon the shape became clearer, the outline of a woman's face. Her features were obscured, but her eyes glowed faintly, staring back at them with a cold, malicious gaze. Lily swallowed hard, her throat dry, as the figure in the mirror became more distinct. The woman's long, dark hair was matted, and her face was horrifying. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with deep, bloody gashes running down her cheeks and across her lips, forming a grotesque, jagged grin. Her eyes were hollow, sunken pits, and yet they seemed to burn with an unnatural light, locking onto each of the girls in turn. "Stop it," Sophie hissed, her voice barely audible. "We need to stop. This isn't right." Before any of them could move, the figure in the mirror shifted. Her bloodied hand slowly lifted, pressing against the inside of the glass. The room grew colder, and the fog on the mirror thickened as her fingers dragged across the surface, leaving streaks of blood in their wake. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, though none of the girls could understand the words. Emma, her confidence now shattered, took a step back. "It's not real," she muttered, but her voice lacked conviction. She tried to convince herself that this was just some elaborate trick of their minds, a product of their collective fear. But deep down, she knew better. The figure was no hallucination. Suddenly, the mirror cracked. A loud, sharp sound echoed through the room as a jagged line split across the glass, and the figure's hand slammed against it once more, causing more fractures to spread like a spider web. Sophie screamed, stumbling backward, her heart racing as the mirror continued to crack, the reflection of Bloody Mary warping and distorting. "Run!" Lily shouted, her voice hoarse with panic. The three girls bolted from the room, the sound of breaking glass and a chilling whisper following them as they fled. They didn't stop running until they were downstairs in the safety of the living room, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. For several minutes they sat in silence, too afraid to speak. The storm outside had quieted, but the memory of what they had seen upstairs was seared into their minds. Emma finally broke the silence, her voice shaking. "It was just our imaginations, right?" she asked, though even she didn't believe her own words. But Sophie wasn't listening. Her eyes were wide and she was staring at something on the floor beside her. Slowly she reached down and picked it up, her fingers trembling as she lifted the shard of glass from the broken mirror, now smeared with fresh blood. Her hand shook as she stared at the red streaks, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Bloody Mary had come, and she had left her mark. It was a cold, quiet night in late autumn, and Mark sat alone in his small house on the outskirts of town, enjoying the stillness that came with living far from the city. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, as he sat reading by the fireplace, the only light in the room coming from the flickering flames. His wife was out of town, and the solitude had always been something Mark cherished, a peaceful reprieve from the chaos of daily life. As the clock neared midnight, he yawned, closing his book and preparing to head to bed. But just as he stood up, there was a knock at the door. It was strange. No one ever came by this late, especially not in this remote area. Mark hesitated, his brow furrowing. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. He moved toward the door, feeling a creeping sense of unease that he couldn't explain. Peering through the peephole, he saw two figures standing on his porch, shrouded in darkness. He flicked on the porch light, and the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Standing on the doorstep were two children, a boy and a girl, both looking no older than 10 or 11. They were dressed in plain, old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and expressionless. But it was their eyes that sent a chill down Mark's spine, completely black, like bottomless voids, with no whites, no pupils, just pitch-black orbs staring back at him. The boy stepped forward, knocking again, more urgently this time. "Sir, we're lost. Can we come in? We need to use your phone." Mark's heart raced, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him, instinct screaming at him to not open the door. Something about these children wasn't right. His hand hovered near the doorknob, but he couldn't bring himself to turn it. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice shaky. "It's late. You shouldn't be out here." The girl tilted her head slightly, her voice cold and flat as she responded, "Please, sir, let us in. We're cold and we need to call our parents." Despite the children's seemingly polite request, every fiber of Mark's being screamed danger. There was something deeply unsettling about their tone, their unnatural stillness. He felt a tight knot of fear in his stomach, his skin prickling with the sensation that he was being watched, that something malevolent was lurking just beneath their innocent facade. He backed away from the door, his breath quickening, the primal instinct to flee overpowering. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "I can't help you." The children didn't move, their black eyes still fixed on the door. "Let us in," the boy repeated, this time more forcefully, his voice now laced with a strange, almost threatening tone. The wind outside picked up, howling like a banshee, as the knocking on the door grew louder, more frantic. Mark stumbled backward, heart pounding, as the overwhelming sense of dread nearly paralyzed him. He knew deep down that if he opened that door, something terrible would happen. As the knocking became relentless, he scrambled for his phone, his shaking hands dialing 911. But when the dispatcher answered, the knocking stopped abruptly. Silence filled the house, heavy and oppressive. Mark froze, listening intently. But when he peeked through the peephole again, the children were gone. There was no sign of them, just the empty porch, illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. For several minutes, Mark stood there, his breath shaky, his mind racing. He didn't know who or what those children were, but the fear they instilled in him was unlike anything he'd ever felt. As the night wore on, he double-checked every door and window, making sure they were locked tight, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, he found no trace of the children, no footprints in the dirt leading to or away from the porch, as though they had never been there at all. Over the following days, the encounter gnawed at him, filling his thoughts with unease. He had heard urban legends about black-eyed children before, stories about people who had encountered them, always at night, always asking to be let inside. But no one knew what happened to those who invited them in. The legends warned of bad luck, illness, or worse, but there were no accounts from anyone who had survived letting them cross the threshold. Mark had been lucky, or perhaps simply wise, not to open the door that night. Though he tried to move on, the memory of those black, soulless eyes haunted him, and the dread lingered long after the children had vanished into the night. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.